The history we learned in school amounts to a sort of civil religion, with the Pilgrims as our origin myth. It's much like the legends held by so-called primitive peoples of their mythic beginnings. And in this civil religion, Plymouth Rock then becomes a shrine, kind of like Mecca. The Mayflower Compact becomes a sacred text. And our high school history textbooks play the same function as, say, maybe the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. We come to school, we read this Book of Common Prayer, and we learn the meaning behind this civil rite, R-I-T-E, this civil rite of Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving is, of course, our religious birth holiday. Thanksgiving, as a holiday, dates only to the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln proclaimed it first in 1863 as a continuing holiday that became our Thanksgiving. Can you understand why the Pilgrims are going to get emphasized by Abraham Lincoln? I mean, that's Massachusetts. He's not going to emphasize Virginia, not in 1863. Virginia's in revolt. The Pilgrims got called Pilgrims only in the 1880s. And why did they get called Pilgrims even then? Well, we wanted to emphasize that they were seeking religious freedom. They actually weren't. They had religious freedom in Holland, which is where they originated. They were seeking better economic opportunities most of all, and they were also seeking a place where they would stay British rather than becoming Dutch, which they were doing in Holland. It's easy to do in Holland. So we wanted to emphasize that they were seeking religious freedom because that seems a little cleaner to us than just in it for the money. I don't really understand that. I mean, we are in a capitalized country, and folks in Virginia were in it for the money, so I don't see what's so bad about that. But nevertheless, that's why we emphasized their religious freedom seeking, and so that's why we called them Pilgrims. Today, Thanksgiving ends up as the ritual in which we reaffirm that God is on our side, and we are an exceptionally good people who deserve His, sorry about that, ladies, His providence. What don't most Americans know about the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving? Well, they don't know what the Pilgrims were really thankful for, first off, which was the plague. I mean, even before the Mayflower sailed, King James of England had given thanks to, quote, Almighty God in His great goodness and bounty towards us for sending this wonderful plague among the salvages. They used to put an L in savages. It's a wonderful plague because it offered an unusual opportunity for British settlement. Okay, it turns out that a huge plague had swept through coastal New England in about 1617. We'll talk about it in a few minutes, but it knocked off about 95% of all of the native peoples. Wonderful opportunity. In the beginning, then, was the land, and it was beautiful. Perhaps it was even more beautiful then than it is now. It was certainly not a virgin wilderness. It was not a wilderness at all. It was park-like, because native people not only let natural fires burn, but they set some of their own. And these little fires promoted a park-like environment, burning out the underbrush. Now, when I ask students about the Indians and the Pilgrims, they do know about Squanto, who happened to know English, and so he interpreted for the Pilgrims with other Indians, and he helped them put fish heads in with the corn, and it grew tall, and that success led to the first Thanksgiving, and that was a celebration the Pilgrims hosted for the nearby Indian tribes. Okay, they even know some more details about Squanto. But not 1 in 100 students has known what was the most important geopolitical event of the early 1600s anywhere in the world, I submit, but certainly in American history, and I'm talking about this Holocaust-like plague that we've mentioned. Squanto's story actually provides a hook into this story. You know, British fishing boats had been fishing off Massachusetts for decades before the Pilgrims landed. It wasn't new land for them. And they would put into shore to get fresh water, to get firewood, and also to capture a few Indians and sell them into slavery. And apparently, well, certainly, in 1615, Squanto and about 20 fellow tribesmen were captured and sold into slavery in Spain. He really got into a heroic tale. He managed to escape. He managed to bribe his way or get his way to Britain. He talks another fisherman into taking him back to Massachusetts in 1619, and he walks to his home village of Patuxet, only to make the unbelievable discovery that he's the sole member of his village still alive. All the rest are corpses. They had perished in this epidemic of about 1617. At this point, he's a man without a people, and when the Pilgrims show up, he joins them. Well, the Pilgrims certainly knew about this plague. Here's an account of it by a historian named Howard Simpson. Quote, "The summer after the Pilgrims landed, they sent 2 envoys on a diplomatic mission to treat with Massasoit, a famous chief encamped some 40 miles away at what is now Warren, Rhode Island. The envoys discovered and described a scene of absolute havoc. Villages lay in ruins because there was no one to tend them. The ground was strewn with the skulls and the bones of thousands of Indians who had died, and none was left to bury them." So that's the landscape the Pilgrims moved into. They actually moved into Squanto's hometown, Patuxet. They found a spring nicely cleared out. They found fields ready to be planted. And how do we treat this? Well, a famous book called it Errand into the Wilderness. It was no wilderness. Here's an account, in fact, from one of the textbooks I examined, a book called Land of Promise. Quote, "Squanto had learned their language," he explained, "from English fishermen who ventured into the New England waters each summer. Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn, squash, and pumpkins," blah, blah, blah. Had learned their language from English fishermen. Well, that's not exactly accurate. He had been enslaved and was in England at least once, possibly twice. Well, so what, we might ask? These textbooks are uplifting. This usual story of the Pilgrims is uplifting. Why not just gloss over the bad parts? After all, as William Buckley once said, history is the polemics of the victor. Well, here's my substantive response to this argument. The plague was of overwhelming importance not only to the Indians but to the Pilgrims as well, because it meant that neither they nor the Puritans who followed would face any major Indian resistance for at least 50 years. Also, it confirmed to them God's providence. 100 years later, Puritan ministers were still telling how God had, quote, "cleared out the underbrush," unquote, to make room for his chosen people. So if history is, among other things, knowledge of the important events of the past, well, the plague is certainly a lot more important than Squanto's assistance, or for that matter, Squanto's name. We ought to know about it. Well, after the Pilgrims arrived, the Puritans came, a more important group, much more numerous. In 1630, they settled Boston. And additional plagues continued to do in the natives. In fact, John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts in 1634, called these plagues miraculous. And he wrote to a friend of his in England, quote, "But for the natives in these parts, God hath so pursued them, as for 300 miles space the greatest part of them are swept away by the smallpox, which still continues among them. So God hath thereby cleared our title to this place. Those who remain in these parts, being in all not 50, have placed themselves under our protection." This is God as the original real estate agent.